Welcome back. So we're going to talk just a little bit in this video about some common attributes of firms that embrace corporate entrepreneurship. And so the first one is proactiveness, right, that they talk about. And what do they talk about by proactiveness? They say, first of all, encouragement to experiment. In other words, it's a firm that says, you know what, I don't know for sure whether that's going to work or not. Maybe I've analyzed it, I think this is going to work, but you know what, I'm going to try it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but I'm willing to take the risk. Okay? That's really a huge part of corporate entrepreneurship. Willingness to try something. Because a lot of stuff's going to fail, but you're at least willing to try. Frame break. You know, every organization has, quite frankly, every organization and every market has perceptions about what can and cannot be done, or the way that things are done or performed, right? You know, every firm gets socialized, or if you watch my isomorphism playlist on this channel, you know, there's certain ways of doing things. There's certain perceptions about what can and cannot be done. If you're willing to break from prevailing attitudes and prevailing ways of doing things, this is what we call frame breaking. Okay? They talk about a willingness to renew or copy ideas. A renewal of an idea would be something like, you know what, remember how they did this really cool thing back in the day? Let's bring that back into the modern age. Normally we think of renewal as invention and things like that. However, I read an interesting article about Carlsberg breweries. And the company felt like it was losing its vision and is losing its strategic direction. And so what they did is they had a historian do research on the history of Carlsberg, and they found this cool slogan. It was Semper Ardens, always burning. And they revived a lot of the old Carlsberg recipes. They revived the old corporate slogan. They revived everything that the way Carlsberg had done things like 100 years ago, and they brought it into the new millennium. So they renewed it. Copying ideas. Again, there's lots of firms out there that are going to do things better than the way you're doing it. Copying ideas happens all the time. You can copy ideas, you can copy inventions, you can copy procedures. Of course, there's always the risk of lawsuit, but hopefully you've changed it enough so that won't happen. Okay? This is what we talk about some of the common attributes. Additionally, corporate entrepreneurial firms, you think about them as excessively risk-taking because they're willing to experiment and all this kind of stuff, but actually it's a way to spread risk. Because if you can enter a new kind of market, new field, start a new strategic business unit, and if it makes money, it helps you ensure that you'll always be able to have a consistent stream of income no matter what. Okay? Let's think of 3M again, because I love that company. You know, right now, I'd be willing to bet you that since a lot of people aren't growing, because we have a coronavirus thing going on right now, I'd be willing to bet you a lot of people are not buying those cheap Bic pens and cheap Bic razors at the grocery store because people aren't going to the groceries that often anymore. Just a hunch. I'd be willing to bet you those strategic business units of the razors and the pens are losing money. Not a problem, because 3M also makes surgical masks, and surgical masks are selling like crazy right now. So yes, you're losing money on pens and razors and stuff like that, but you're making way more money than usual on surgical masks, so it kind of evens out. And I'd be willing to bet you when this coronavirus thing kind of ends, people start going back to the grocery store en masse, and there'll be more trips to the grocery store, and I'd be willing to bet you they're going to buy those cheap pens and razors in a pretty good quantity once they go back. So by launching into these new strategic business units like pens and razors and stuff like that, they are spreading their risk among multiple strategic business units. A firm that wants to engage in corporate entrepreneurship also has to have aspirations beyond their current capability. Okay? In other words, it needs to be a firm that says, the way we're doing things right now is not good enough. We want to do better. It has to be a firm that has a team orientation. People have to be willing to work together to be on the same page. That is a huge deal. Okay? They've got to be willing to do better. And they have to be willing to not have an ego in the process of doing better. They have to be willing to acknowledge that personal sacrifice is needed for the good of the company. They also have to have some sort of a capability to resolve dilemmas. They've got to have a good strategic officer. They've got to have good, or at least the financial capital to hire consultants, assuming they don't have any internal consultants. They've got to be able to look at what the organization's problems are and find some way around those problems or some way to solve those problems. And they have to have a learning capability. Organizations that don't learn from their mistakes are bound to repeat them. So they've got to be willing to learn from their mistakes in the past and find new ways to make sure they don't do the same thing again. One thing that you've got to remember, on a totally new note with corporate entrepreneurship, there are two types of change. There's what we call linear change, where you get incrementally better at doing the same or similar things, and then there's what we call metamorphic change, where the nature of what the firm is doing is fundamentally different. Again, think of Nokia going from a paper company to being a BlackBerry technology company. Think of Apple going from being just a computer company to phones, music, etc., etc. That would be an example of metamorphic change. Versus think about 3M as they make better adhesives for sticky notes. Well, it's still sticky note adhesives, it's just a better adhesive. Or they make better, protective masks than they did before. Well, it's still the same thing, it's just better than it was before. Okay? And so there's some different steps that they outline in this article for corporate entrepreneurship, and they basically say that it starts with some sort of an individual entrepreneurial process. So somebody in the firm has a cool idea or some sort of a cool new way of doing things. That's the individual idea. And then they start this kind of new idea, and they kind of start implementing it just a little bit, and then people kind of start to accept it, and that's what they call embedding the renewal. And then once they're totally confident with it, then they go ahead and they engage in the frame breaking. They fundamentally change operations throughout the company, they fundamentally change what's going on in the market, etc., etc. Okay? Now the question that I want you to ask yourself, when you're looking at these characteristics of corporate entrepreneurship, these common attributes, aspirations beyond current capability, team orientation, capability to resolve dilemmas and learning capability, plus, and these steps of corporate entrepreneurship, such as individual entrepreneurship, starting the renewal process, embedding the renewal, and breaking the frame, ask yourself, is this really all that different than what a regular entrepreneur does? I mean, let's face it, as an individual entrepreneur, don't you have to be proactive? Don't you have to be willing to experiment and try something, see if it works or not? Don't you have to be willing to frame break? Don't you have to be willing to renew ideas? Don't you have to be willing to copy if that's useful? Okay. Don't you have to have an aspiration beyond what you're currently doing? Don't you want to have, whether it's opportunity or necessity-based entrepreneurship, don't you want to be in a better position, whether it's intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation? Don't you want to be in a better position than you were before? Okay, individual entrepreneurs don't always have to have a team orientation, that's true. Don't you need to be able to resolve problems, whether it's inefficiencies in the market or a desire to meet some sort of generic aspiration? And don't you, as an individual entrepreneur, need to be willing to learn from your mistakes? Same thing with the steps. They both start, of course, with an individual entrepreneurial process. But again, don't you need to start the renewal process? Don't you need to start implementing your new ideas? Don't you need to be willing to break dominant paradigms? The point that I'm making is, Stopford and Van Fuller say these are some interesting techniques or interesting motivations for corporate entrepreneurs, but it's exactly the same as what you might find among regular entrepreneurs. It's just to the organizational level. And so that's got to lead you to believe, well, is it possible that the entrepreneur is the organization and not an individual entrepreneur? And if you're thinking that, you've exactly nailed the essence of corporate entrepreneurship. The organization itself is the entrepreneur, not an individual person. It's an individual person behaving entrepreneurially, but in the process, the organization itself becomes the entrepreneur. I hope you've enjoyed this particular video. In the next video, we're going to start looking at French corporate entrepreneurship. We've got 2 examples. I hope you enjoy them. And as always, if you like my channel and you like my videos, give me a thumbs up. That's a like. Subscribe below, comment below. Make sure you subscribe. Looking forward to seeing the next video.